Lesson 4.7, Inverse Linear Functions. In this lesson, you will learn to find the inverse of a relation and to find the inverse of a linear function. So, what is an inverse of a relation? If one relation contains the elements a, comma, b, then the inverse relation will contain the element b, comma, a. So, if we're looking at this, if this is this set A has each of these points in it. Then the inverse of A is going to have these points in it. So basically, all you're doing to find the inverse of a relation is switching the x and the y. Switch the independent and dependent variables. Okay, so if I want to find the inverse of this relation, all I'm doing is rewriting it, switching the x and y values. So 26, negative 3, 11, 2, negative 1, 6, and 20, negative 1. And so this would be the inverse of that relation. Easy, right? So the inverse of this one, if I'm going to keep the same pattern, x and y, I'm just switching them. So I'm going to have negative 3, negative 4, 0, negative 2, 4.5, 1, and 10.5, 5. All right, we can do the same thing with a graph. So if this is a graph, we can find the inverse of a line by switching our x and our y values. So looking at this, I have a point here. This point is negative 1, 4. So if I want to graph the inverse, I'm going to have the point 4, negative 1. So 4, negative 1 would be here. I could find another point. So like this point here, this is the point 0, 2. So on my inverse graph, I'm going to have the point 2, 0. 2, 0 here. And this one here is the point 1, negative 1. So that means the point negative 1, 1 is going to be on my graph. So negative 1, 1. Hang on. That's the point 0. Sorry, 1, 0. So this is going to be the point 0, 1. So right there. Sorry. Got that. Okay, so with that, you can just draw a line through any of the points you got. You really only need to use 2 of them. But if you wanted to use more than 2 points, that's okay. I used 3 just to make it a little bit easier to draw. But you only need 2 if you have a ruler. Okay, so if I want to graph the inverse of this one, same thing. Like I have a point here. This is the point 3, 3. So the inverse of the point 3, 3 is still 3, 3. So I'm going to actually leave that point there. It's going to stay. Let's see. I have this point here. That is 1, 0. So its inverse is going to be 0, 1, which will be right there. So far I have the point 3, 3 and 0, 1. I can use this point here, which is negative 1, negative 3. So the inverse is going to have the point negative 3, negative 1. So negative 3, negative 1 would be here. And the point 0, 1 disappeared. Okay, and then I'm just connecting these 3 points that I have, more or less. And that is the inverse. Okay. So if I want to do this algebraically, so like right now, I was able just to do it by switching it. But if I wanted to take the equation of this line and get to the equation of this line without having to graph it, this is the process that you can use. So if you have a function f of x, its inverse, f negative 1, so we call it inverse. We use this notation. That means inverse. Okay, so the inverse, what we're going to do is we're going to take our function f of x and replace f of x with y. So if I have, for example, f of x equals 2x plus 5, I'm just going to say this is the same thing as y equals 2x plus 5. Okay, so that's step 1. Step 2 is you interchange x and y. So that means you switch them. So this is going to be x equals 2y plus 5. All I did is I switched x and y. Okay, so that's step 2. Step 3 is to get y by itself. So if I want to get y by itself, I would do minus 5, and I would get x minus 5 equals 2y. And then I would divide everything by 2. So y would be x minus 5 over 2. And then the last step, once the y is by itself, is you just, instead of calling it y now, we want to call it f inverse of x. So f negative 1 of x equals x minus 5 over 2. And now I have my inverse function. Okay, so let's do another example of this. So step 1, I replace f of x with y. Step 2, I switch x and y. Step 3, I get y by itself, so I do minus 27 to both sides. So I get x minus 27 equals negative 3y. Last step, I divide by negative 3. So I'm going to get negative 1/3 x plus 9 equals y. And then last step, instead of y, I'm just going to call it f inverse of x. And then you have your inverse function. Okay, let's do one more. So first step, replace f of x with y. Second step, switch x and y. Get y by itself. So now I'm going to multiply by 4/5 to get that y alone. And it gets multiplied to the entire thing. So I get 4/5 x plus 32 over 5 equals y. And now step, instead of y, I'm calling it f inverse, or f negative 1. Okay, and that's it. So we wanted to do this with a word problem and just kind of make sense out of it, as when you would use this. Carter sells paper supplies and makes a base salary of $2,200 each month. He also earns 5% commission on his total sales. His total earnings, f of x, for the month in which he compiled x dollars in total sales is this. Okay, so if I want to find the inverse of the function, first step is replacing f of x with y. Second step is to switch x and y. And then get y by itself. So I get 1/2 x minus 1/10. Dividing by 1/2, not multiplying. So this is going to be 4. 2 minus 440 equals y. Okay, so then from there, the last thing I'm doing is I'm just calling f inverse of x equals 2x minus 4400. Okay, so part 2, it says, what do x and f inverse x represent in the context of the inverse function? So in our problem, x is the dollars in total sales, and f of x is the total earnings. So if we switched x and y, that means in f negative 1 of x, instead of it being f of x representing the total earnings, it's going to be the total sales. And that means that x is going to represent the total earnings. So basically, instead of having an equation that will take the total amount of money you sold to figure out how much you earned, it takes how much you earned to figure out how much you sold. It does the opposite of what the first equation did. So here we want to find the total sales based off of his earnings for the month. So remember our equation, f inverse of x was 2x minus 4400. So they say, this is my X. I'm putting that in to figure out what his total earnings were. So f negative 1 of X is going to be 2 times 3450 minus 440, 4,400. So multiply these together, 0, 10, 8, 9, 6, 6900 minus 4400. So I get 24,000 is going to be his total earnings. I'm sorry, it's his total sales based off his total earnings. And that is it for this section. So you can go through and do some of these practice problems, check your answers, blah, blah, blah.